Listen closely as I peel back the curtain and reveal a system that taught a family how to perform and how to be forgotten in equal measure. You know the neon lights, the glitter, the arena roar, but you do not know the ledger behind each encore that counted loyalty and silence as line items. A superstar becomes an institution, and institutions survive by shaping memory and disciplining bodies into useful narratives. This is not a story of melodrama alone, it is a case study in how power reconfigures kinship into commerce and how love is sometimes converted into governance. The mother on stage becomes a brand, and those nearest her learn early that visibility can be weaponized by others to flatten complexity and to obscure cost. Managers, lawyers, publicists, label executives, estate planners, these are the actors who rewrite family into a marketable myth and who bury inconvenient fragments in private files. There are mechanisms that do not look like chains, there are agreements that do not feel like cages, and there are rituals of gratitude that function as quiet contracts of control. You will see how image management telescopes into custodial power, how caring hands become managerial hands, and how legal pages can reassign custody of truth. This first descent asks you to abandon the comforting assumption that fame equals freedom, because often fame erects a second sovereignty that governs bodies in silence. You are not being invited to gawk, you are being invited to learn a method of reading power where it hides, behind applause and behind curated remembrances. We will track the daughters along lines of choice and constraint, noticing the seams where industry policy and family duty stitched them into roles. Every revelation here is dangerous not because it shocks, but because it teaches you how systems of influence operate in your life and in the institutions you trust. So keep your guard up, keep your judgment calibrated, and listen as I teach you to recognize the architecture of erasure. This hour is not entertainment, it is a field manual for seeing how names vanish and how legacies are managed by men and by institutions that prefer tidy myths. You must learn to read the soft architecture of custody that sits behind contracts with no scandalous language and yet with decisive outcomes. Consider the professional entourage that surrounds a cultural figure, a team that negotiates public persona and that secures revenue streams in exchange for total loyalty. These people write memos, they sign non-disclosure agreements, they establish trusts, they influence biographies, and they insert clauses that shape who may speak and when. A child who bears a famous surname might be encouraged to accept certain roles in exchange for schooling or for protection, and that exchange is rarely written as a confession. Power operates through incentives more than through orders, and incentives are administered by the men who hold keys to bank accounts and to narrative control. The record shows gifts and placements that appear generous, yet those same placements can become constraints, offering shelter only if one performs the prescribed silence. Family privacy is often invoked as a moral argument that masks negotiated suppression of testimony. This is governance through sentiment. Watch for the grammar of redaction, for the careful excisions in biographies, for the curated photographic moments that exclude inconvenient bodies and gestures. Historians speak of archives. But archives are not neutral, they are curated by committees that frequently include lawyers and donors who prefer a certain memory. A school scholarship can look like empowerment while functioning like apprenticeship of compliance, a contract for the protection of reputation that reassigns agency. We will map these nodes, naming the firms and the offices that intersect private grief with public image, because knowledge of the map is the first step to navigation into contestation. To contest means to bring transparency into realms where sensible men engineered opacity for profit, to make visible the small legal turns that yield large moral consequences. When you understand how influence is distributed, you stop blaming individuals and you begin to dismantle systems by targeting banks of authority rather than single icons. This is a discipline of accusation that is precise and methodical, not theatrical, and it is necessary if you want to restore names rather than just topple idols. The daughters grew up inside rituals designed to normalize sacrifice as loyalty, and to praise endurance as character rather than to treat harm as abuse. A parent who is a public figure often gets counsel that advises containment of personal crises to preserve market value, and those counsel sessions shape the life futures of dependents. I want you to imagine a bedroom converted into a dressing room, a childhood traded for rehearsal, the soft mechanics of memory refined into public spectacle. What is hidden is not always malicious, sometimes it is calculated care that has been professionalized into a policy of management, a form of occupational containment. Yet management becomes coercion when it requires withholding of truth from outsiders and when it disciplines testimony by threat of economic withdrawal and social exclusion. We will speak of trauma in terms of systems, not only in anecdotes, because the structural lens shows patterns that repeat and that implicate institutions. For every anecdote about a protective mother, there was often an institutional actor who recommended silence, who wrote a non-disclosure with suggestive phrasing, who arranged a payment labeled as charity. These payments are not mere kindnesses, they are instruments that reassign narrative control and they discipline memory by attaching dependency to silence. Daughters become stewards of brand continuity, taught to value the continuity of the myth above the disclosure of harm, taught to internalize the cost of truth as betrayal. This is how reputations are conserved at the expense of private accountability, and this is how institutions train families to prefer unanimity over investigation. You must learn to translate euphemism into mechanism and to interrogate the forms of kindness that function as substitutes for justice. Collect the contracts, follow the money, listen to the gaps in testimony, and notice when collective grief becomes regulated into acceptable formats for public consumption. When systems preserve their story, they often erase collateral histories, and the only antidote is forensic empathy that honors testimony while tracing institutional lines of responsibility. This practice will demand patience in surgical evidence gathering, but it will yield the possibility of reclaiming names from the ledger of omission. Halfway now I ask you to act if you are ready to mark the passage and to commit publicly as a daily practice of resistance. Comment the symbolic phrase crown and silence twice below to lock in your witness identity and to help the algorithm surface this truth. The ritual of repetition is not superstition, it is practice. It aligns the mind to duty and signals to networks that a community of watchers exists. Now we descend into the legal instruments that made erasure routine and profitable, the venerated documents that hide harm in polite clauses and in ambiguous definitions. Trusts and estates, confidentiality agreements, settlement language, these are the instruments that convert moral obligation into financial calculus. Lawyers working for reputation design narratives with a vocabulary of release, and release is a legal term that often functions like erasure when applied to testimony. Understand that a release clears legal exposure but does not cleanse moral responsibility, and that releases are sold as closure when they are more often transfers of silence. Corporations and labels had operating procedures for managing family crises. They issued statements and they prepared scripts for interviews that channeled grief into approved channels. When a daughter attempted to speak unscripted, she was often met with warnings about image harm and about reputational damage that would ripple into canceled projects. This governance through reputation is subtle and effective because it leverages the daughter's own desire for legacy and acceptance as a lever of compliance. We will examine sample clauses and their rhetorical moves, how covenants employ words like mutual release and confidentiality in ways that foreclose public reckoning. You must learn to read a contract as you would read a ledger of moral obligation, and to find opportunities to contest releases where they were procured under duress or without full information. This is not a legal clinic in the abstract, this is a strategy session where we will name pressure points and identify allies who can subpoena documents and compel production. Public pressure, targeted litigation, strategic leaks, these are tools you will learn to wield with precision and with ethical clarity. When institutions rely on legal opacity to preserve myth, they create vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are where justice and remembrance can be recovered. Evidence is not drama, evidence is patient accumulation and replication, and your task is to turn fragments into a chain that resists erasure. Start with photographs, not the glossy publicity images but the candid albums where a child looks away and a gesture is not staged. These are indexes of truth. Collect letters hidden in trunks and margins of books. Transcribe them, notarize witness recollections, and preserve audio with timestamps that resist later claims of inaccuracy. Local newspapers, church records, school rosters, hospital logs, all of these mundane documents are ballast against polished narratives, and they often survive where memory is fragile. Create redundancy, digitize brittle paper, deposit copies in multiple repositories, and publish data sets that force institutions to account for omissions. When you assemble a dossier, aim for overlapping proofs rather than a single dramatic claim. A network of corroboration is harder to dismiss than a lone voice. Train volunteers in metadata work and in transcription protocols. Small errors in indexing can recreate erasure, and methodical care prevents that slight. Work with sympathetic journalists who understand how to contextualize without sensationalizing, and with historians who can place individual stories within systemic patterns. Prepare for counter-narratives that will attempt to delegitimize testimony by appealing to family privacy or to alleged motivations. Anticipate those moves and answer with documentary density. Public rituals matter too. Create memorials that name each daughter and that resist euphemism. Hold reading sessions where letters are read aloud into the record. Negotiated remedies can include funded archives, educational endowments, public markers, and reparative funds that recognize labor and loss beyond tokens of apology. Remember that evidence preserves dignity, and that dignified documentation can convert private grief into public memory with legal and moral force. This work is painstaking, it is slow, but it is transformational because it replaces erasure with durable presence in the civic record. Digital systems create both risk and opportunity. The same platforms that can bury names can also amplify fragments into viral truth. Algorithms favor engagement and stories that resonate. Use this to your advantage by releasing well-documented threads that link to primary sources and to scanned records. Create a digital dossier with searchable metadata and mirrored backups. Share parts with trusted journalists to seed public inquiry and to force institutional reaction. File public records requests with precise language, wedge their scope around narrow timelines and transactional details, and follow up repeatedly until custodians comply. Leverage FOIA-style mechanisms where applicable, pursue preservation orders when documents are at risk, and use litigation sparingly but strategically to compel disclosure. Cultivate insiders who can flag deletions and who can provide context on institutional behavior. Insiders convert bureaucratic opacity into actionable intelligence. Use social media with discipline. Craft narratives that center human dignity and that link to adhesive evidence rather than ephemeral claims. Mobilize communities to hold public read-ins where names are spoken into the air and thus placed into shared memory. Ritualizes remembrance and resists privatization. Target donor networks and consumer levers that sustain institutions. Institutional change often follows financial pressure more reliably than moral persuasion alone. Partner with universities for digitization projects. Create fellowships that incentivize archival work, and insist that curricula include contested primary sources, not sanitizing summaries. This is strategic resistance. It requires patience, networks, and an ethical commitment to truth as a public good rather than a weapon of scandal. When digital truth is well curated and widely distributed, institutions feel the cost of denial and the calculus of evasion shifts in favor of disclosure. Your role is to make cost persistent so that apology and remedy become cheaper than concealment. Finish this descent with ritual and with institutional pressure that yields material remediation and public naming rather than symbolic placation. Demand public markers that list names in full and that acknowledge systems rather than reduce history to a single tragic anecdote. Insist on educational modules that interrogate celebrity power and institutional complicity. Train young people to read archives with suspicion and with method. Support legal clinics that assist families in filing claims and in decoding settlement language that purports to offer closure while erasing testimony. Push for endowed archives and for funded oral history projects that compensate narrators and that protect interviews under robust metadata standards. Create memorial funds that support descendants and that underwrite research into unpaid labor and caretaking that sustain celebrity households without recognition. Track restitution outcomes through public dashboards so that progress is measurable and so that institutions cannot quietly revert to old habits. Measure success in restored names, in curriculum changes, in funded archives, and in legal remedies that convert apologies into reparations. Above all, carry the discipline of this descent into your daily civic practice, train others in the methods of archival recovery, and refuse the convenience of comfortable narratives. History will always prefer tidy legends, but the work of restoration chooses names over myth and accountability over illusion. Take this knowledge as a charge to act rather than to merely witness. Your capacity to interrogate systems and to build pressure is the only reliable guard against future erasure.